My name is Luis Espinosa, and I'm the Director for the Office of Evangelization and Catechesis. And so today we're going to continue with Teaching Tuesdays. Teaching Tuesdays, in this case, we're going to focus a little bit more on what are ministries and what are orders. And so in previous episodes, we talked a little bit about the ministries of the church, but also in the orders of the church. But I did want, before I go into more detail about the ministries, I wanted to just clarify about what has been the experience of the church over the previous thousands of years. When I say this, it's in reality because since Vatican II, the church reformed the sacred liturgy, reformed the way we celebrate Mass, but then also reformed what was understood as the pathway to ordination to priesthood. And so when I say this, LECTOR and ACOLYTE were two of the ministries that were taken from what were formerly known as orders. And so since the Council of Trent, all the way up to Second Vatican Council, the Church understood that there's 7 steps, 7 ordinations leading up to ordination to priesthood. And they called every single rite an ordination. And so we see that in the church, the lower or minor orders, the minor orders consisted of 4, being first it was the porter, the lector, the exorcist, and the acolyte. So these first 4 ordinations, these first 4 orders were considered the minor orders. So again, this is from the Council of Trent all the way to Second Vatican Council. Then the major orders were the next 3. And they were also ordinations, and it was a subdeacon, deacon, and priest. So these 7 ordinations were the way that the church, in her ordination rites, would eventually be able to celebrate and have a new priest in the church. And so these 7 orders. So this again is from the Council of Trent to the Second Vatican Council. But then one of the many things, like I said earlier, that the church saw and that it needed to reform and revisit and see what are those steps that are actually necessary, required, or even should be used by our church. And so Saint Paul VI, in response to several gatherings, meetings, getting feedback from many of the bishops, decided that one of the things that need to be looked at and refashioned is what are the minor orders and are they all necessary? Which of the major orders are necessary? And so in 1972, Pope Paul VI, St. Paul VI, publishes a letter, a MOTU PROPRIO, meaning on his own accord, he publishes Ministeria Quaedam, where he reminds the church that the church has always had ministries and orders. Ministries in that there are specific functions in the church that are for service, that are mostly done by the laity. And so in this letter, Pope Paul VI decides to suppress what was known as the order of porter and exorcist, and he decides to change the verbiage or the way that we refer to the other 2 orders that are lector and acolyte. He decided that since it was exclusively, or more importantly, for the laity to fulfill a service in the church, that they would be rephrased and recoined as ministry, no longer ordination. So ministries keeping to what was the role of the laity versus ordination that would be limited to or be a part of what could be considered part of the clergy, clerics. And so, like I shared earlier, that not just the minor orders were reformed, were modified, adapted, so were the major orders. And so the major orders before Vatican II, we had the subdeacon, deacon, and priest. Well, part of that discussion was that the subdeacon was no longer seen as necessary at this time of the Reform, and that many of the things that were given as tasks, functions within the liturgy to the subdeacon would then be passed down to the acolyte. And so the subdeacon was the order that was suppressed, that was no longer to be used by the Latin Rite Church, by us, by the Catholic Church. So then the major orders get renamed as orders, sacred orders. So from major orders to sacred orders, in that then there is a distinction made also in incorporating, so it will become the deacon, priest, and then now we're talking about the bishop's episcopacy. So that these three orders would be now considered part of holy orders. And that the ones I mentioned previously that were once known as part of the minor orders are now ministries in the church. So I did want to share with you just that opening 2 lines that Saint Paul VI wrote in Ministeria Quaedam. He wrote, certain ministries were established by the church even in the most ancient times for the purpose of suitability, giving worship to God, and for the offering service to the people of God according to their needs. By these ministries, the offices to be carried out in the liturgy and the practice of charity, deemed suitable to varying circumstances, were entrusted to the faithful. So he, at the beginning of this document, of this letter, he reminds us of that we as laity have a service to the church, and that based on our gifts and our talents, we can help both in the celebration of liturgy, worship, but also in the service of charity and the things that we do and help our brothers and sisters. So then one of the other things, like I said, is that we no longer are going to be referring to all these different ordinations, but then instead for the ministries, now we're referring to them as going, in order to establish a person fulfilling that role in the ministry, it would be through the rite of institution. So that the acolyte and the lector, lector and acolyte would be instituted. They would celebrate the rite of institution versus what was previously known as a rite of ordination. So then a person, we understand in this case, at this time, that men were the ones called and chosen to fulfill those roles and be instituted by the bishop. So men were called to have and fulfill this role as a lector and as an acolyte. So one of the things that was changed and reformed also, not just the liturgy, not just in this case the steps to ordination to the priesthood, but then as a consequence, canon law had to be revised and changed and modified. And so part of the revision done in 1983 of the Code of Canon Law, we see that certain numbers, certain canons are added and things are clarified a little bit better for us as laity. And so in Code of Canon Law, we look at canons 224 to 231. These canons talk more about the obligations and rights of the lay Christian faithful. So what are things that you and I should be aware of? And what are those now ministries? What do they entail and what should be done for each respective ministry, whether it be the lector or acolyte? And so this is what Pope Francis changed recently. If we think back in January, he issued and he told us through the document MOTU PROPRIO Spiritus Domini, he made a change to canon law. And so what change was made? In Canon 230, it used to say that laymen were able to become instituted lectors and acolytes. Well, in January of this year, in 2021, he changed that word or that phrase from saying laymen to lay persons. So what did this mean for us in the church? That meant that now women also can be instituted into this ministry of lector and acolyte. And so if you look at Canons 230 to 31, it gives us a better idea of what it meant when it said that we could participate and fulfill this role. Remembering that after Vatican II, one of the things that we were able to do as laities to be able to take on certain roles that we didn't have before. Now I use the word roles because we are all called to participate in Mass by our attendance, by our being present, in being fully active, conscious, participating in the sacred liturgy. But certain members of the faithful, certain laity, are also called and asked to take on additional roles at the sacred liturgy at Mass. And so these roles that have been done by many people over the past years since the reform of the liturgy have been to be able to function in those roles of what we now could consider looking at reader and even acolyte, that we sometimes call altar server. And so these things have already been in place. When we talk about acolyte, I can't help but to also think about that some people are called and asked to help the priest with distribution of Holy Communion. And so this person is commissioned. Notice the word I'm using, commissioned, not instituted. It's commissioned to be an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion. So that was the person that was fulfilling the role of the acolyte, of helping the priest, helping distribute communion to all our faithful who are willing, who are properly disposed and ready to receive Christ in the Eucharist. So then as we look at this, one of the other things that we would want to consider is that ever since the ministries, ever since that these orders were modified, were changed, were reformed, we also have to think about then in the church for many years, we only had these two ministries. So when I say many years, I really talk about since the 1972 up to now that we've had the ministry of lector and acolyte. So then another change happens for us in the church. And so we think about it, back in May, on May 11th, Pope Francis issues another MOTU PROPRIO. In this case, he issues the document Antiquum Ministerium. And in this document, he decides to establish a new ministry. The new ministry is the ministry of catechist. If we think back and we revisit for a moment, Ministeria Quaedam, that was published by St. Paul VI, he did mention the ministry of catechist as a ministry that had been already fulfilled, but never was it established a ministry as such with its own right. And so what Pope Francis does for us is that now he says, this role, this function, this service, this ministry of catechist has been an essential role in the church. And talks to us more about, especially in those areas where there's a lack of priests, that the catechist has helped bring the community and keep the community together by teaching, by handing on the faith. And so the catechist is a very important person in these areas where, again, like I said, is there's a lack of priests, and one of the baptized is called to help organize, to help teach the faith. Because in the end, the ministry of catechist is to teach, to hand on, to pass on the faith. And so what we're going to be looking forward to is sometime in the future, being able to have another right in the church. Just like we have the right of institution for a lector, for an acolyte, we will eventually have the right for the institution of a catechist, of where the bishop will celebrate this right, of where he will call forth these persons men and women to come forward, to present themselves so they can receive a blessing and they could be instituted formally as a catechist to help the bishop and the priests to spread the faith throughout the diocese. And so I wanted to share this with you because it's important that we understand where we were, what were the ministries and orders, and where we are at now. In that today, a person who is baptized, who is fully initiated, can go through the rite of institution to be instituted as a lector, as an acolyte, and now, God willing, in the future, be instituted as a catechist. And so I want you to consider and pray about this. Is God calling you to this special service and ministry of catechist? Called from among the baptized, from among those of us that are fully initiated, to be able to help spread the faith, to spread the teachings of our great Catholic Church.